The EU and the USA have just signed a controversial trade agreement, and not everyone is celebrating. While tariffs hit European goods, American products remain untouched. Is this a diplomatic defeat for the EU or a desperate move to avoid economic escalation? Stay tuned, we're going to continue right after the intro discussing all these points. Hello and welcome to yet another video from Bloomberg Capital. My name is Patrick and I have my esteemed colleague Henrik sitting next to me. Today we're going to be discussing the EU-US trade deal and what it actually means. So if we summarize this, Henrik, what does this whole deal mean for the EU and the citizens for the EU? And what does it comprise of? What deal was even taken here?
So most importantly, there will be a general tariff of 15% on European goods, without any reciprocal tariffs on US goods. Furthermore, the increased 50% tariffs will remain on steel and aluminium exports. But there are also some other promises that the EU made, which is on one hand, a commitment to purchasing $750 billion worth of energy, mainly consisting of fossil fuels here, over the next 3 years for the rest of Trump's presidency. But currently, the EU is actually only importing about $76 billion per year. So there would be an immense increase of about 3 times. So then the question stands whether or not that is actually possible, even when reducing gas imports from Russia. And furthermore, von der Leyen doesn't really have the authority to dictate energy imports of the individual nations of the EU. And the EU actually previously planned to drastically reduce fossil fuel imports because of their environmental policies. Also, EU companies promise to invest about $600 billion into the US, which is a large sum, but on the other hand, the EU cannot really enforce this in any way. Likewise, there are plans for renewed American defense investments, despite the EU's prior strategy to develop its own domestic defense industry. And here comes a big caveat, because if these prior promises here are not fulfilled, then Trump has already said that the tariffs would likely be raised again. So then the question stands if this deal can even hold in its current form, or if any of these extra promises will actually be fulfilled.
Thanks, Henrik. So from the point of view of the Europeans, is there anything positive that we can talk about? So far, this sounds pretty much like a downer.
Well, there are actually some benefits, at least depending on how you look at it. Because in the short term, some sectors definitely will benefit from this new deal, especially the automotive industry, whose export tariffs are now dropping from 27.5% to 15%, which already benefited some automakers in Germany, like for example Porsche, which you already made a video not too long ago. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out on our channel. But furthermore, sort of the main thing that is the positive here for the European Union is the avoidance of a further escalation of a trade war, because Trump actually threatened to raise all tariffs to 30% on the 1st of August, which was now avoided. The question now is, why did this deal come together as it did right now?
Well, I do believe that this deal came together because the EU is out of options. China, for instance, isn't really importing any more goods from the EU. They are on a steady decline. And furthermore, China technology is on the forefront. It's becoming better. For instance, in the car industry, we see more and more Chinese vendors actually go into European and American markets where they can sell more car and more competitive cars that are actually reasonably priced for most consumers. Therefore, China is not really an option, and therefore the EU sees itself in a very big pickle because the German car industry, for instance, hasn't really innovated too much, and they have completely missed the boat when it comes to electric vehicles because they are simply too expensive and the tech isn't as good as the Chinese tech, for instance. And therefore, we have to get an agreement to actually export our product here. Therefore, the EU was left out of options to really do anything, and therefore short-term benefits are again being conducted at the detriment of the longer term consequences that this deal might have. So, what do you feel about the EU, Henrik? Did anyone get a better deal, or is this type of a deal the type of deal you get with Trump?
We actually saw some prior trade deals happening, mainly the one with the UK. And here we actually saw that the UK actually got a better deal than the one the EU got. At this point, was this really the best deal you could get? And if it was, then what's even the point of the EU? Because the main purpose of the EU should be to have a combined economic strength to leverage in exactly this type of negotiation. And in general, many Europeans and many trade organizations in the EU are very dissatisfied with the current agreement and expect major economic damage in the billions. Especially French President Macron is particularly opposed to the agreement and might exercise his veto. In general, von der Leyen lacks the authority to push this deal through by herself, making it only a provisional agreement that still needs to be approved from the European Parliament as well as the individual member states. So this deal may actually not come to pass in its current state.
So you did point out to something crucial that we have to ask ourselves completely. For instance, what's the purpose of the EU? If states that left the EU are getting better deals, this would mean that the complete purpose of the EU is not there anymore. It's just not present. And therefore, nobody's taking the EU seriously. Therefore, this system needs to overhaul itself, or we need a much more aggressive EU that has its personal interests also aligned. So far, it appears that the EU is simply a puppet of the Americans to make them even wealthier. And therefore, things need to change. And I believe that this is going to start a big debate in the EU itself, because if we can't really get anything out of there, why should states be members of the EU? And I think this question is going to be debated quite frequently now, and it's going to cause for internal rumblings. However, I think we should appreciate that fact that this is going to happen, because then we can finally make reforms that actually drive the EU forward. Henrik, how do you feel about this deal, and what does that actually mean for the European citizen? Do they have to pay more because inflation's rising? Like, what's going to happen there?
Well, actually, that's not going to happen, at least not in the EU. That's actually something we will most likely see in the US, because the effect that this deal will have on the US is that, well, of course, European wares that are exported into the US will have a tariff placed on them. And then importers will have to pay this tariff and then pass it on to the consumer, meaning that prices, at least for European wares in the US, will rise and will therefore likely fuel further inflation. But on the other hand, it will actually also lead to some tariff income for the government. On the EU side, the effect will be less so on the individual consumers or citizens and more so on the major companies, at least those that are focused on exports. Because in the EU, the export sector will lose its competitiveness, which will likely lead to severe losses and a likely job migration to the US, because many companies would rather move some jobs into the US and produce their wares there instead of producing them in the EU than exporting them and paying a tariff. And it is already estimated that about 70,000 jobs from the auto industry alone will move to the US because of this deal. And furthermore, we saw these added on promises, which are massive investments pledged towards the US, which would obviously have more impact and a better effect on Europeans if that money stayed within Europe. So in general, we can say that Trump sold some stability and predictability of the markets at a very steep price to the Europeans here. And we can say that the days of equal footing in negotiations are certainly over. Europe's days of being in a power position are long gone, and now they have to suck up to the other major powers in the world. And there will likely be some troubling times for the Europeans ahead.
If you liked our video, please leave us a like and also share our video. Additionally, we would be grateful if you could subscribe to our channel, as it helps us out in the algorithm. Thanks again, and until next time, here at Bloomberg Capital.